Today we're at Waverley Abbey. It's a fascinating little ruin, and I'll be very clear, it is very much a ruin. But it's down in Surrey. It was a Cistercian abbey founded in 1128 by William Giffard. If you saw our video last week of Wolversley Palace, he was the predecessor of Henry de Blois, and it's 2 miles outside of Farnham, sitting on the floodplain next to the river here. And if you look between the trees, you can see a clue as to why the abbey ruins are quite how they look today. They've been left to fall into rack and ruin, but they've been maintained. Because Waverley Abbey House was built in 1725 on this lovely bend on the river, and it was decided that it would be a very good idea to keep the abbey ruins as a feature. And there were beautiful gardens here which are a bit less than they used to be, although they're magnificent, well worth a visit. Lovely views over the river with swans and cygnets and ducks. Beautiful little bridge we'll see in a minute. But over there in the distance you could probably make out the forms of the abbey, and it's mainly walls. There's a couple of first floor ceilings where there was beautiful fan vaulting, but really all of this land would have belonged to the abbey. And as always, someone did well out of a dissolution. The Valor Ecclesiasticus 1535 said that the abbey had an income of £174 8 shillings 3.5 pence, which might not seem like much now. It'll probably buy you dinner for a few people across the river, but it was a huge amount of money. This was the very first Cistercian abbey in Britain. Cistercians were, and still are, a branch of the Benedictine order. So they follow the rule of Saint Benedict, and they've been very important monks over the centuries. Actually comes from Cistercium, which is the Latin name for Citeaux near Dijon, where they originated. The order was founded in 1098 by Robert of Molsem, Albert de Citeaux and Stephen Harding. And actually, if you think, it was founded in 1098. 30 years later, in 1128, the Bishop of Winchester was inviting them to found a abbey in the English countryside. So they grew quite fast, and they were a powerful order, and they were invited over to create this as their English mother house. So it was the first of the abbeys, and although it was slenderly endowed, so it wasn't given a huge sum of money, and the monks did have a lot of poor times, it was used as a beachhead into England to form monasteries. Now, it doesn't seem to have been particularly the best land. You often go to an abbey and you see vast swaths of land that formed the abbey property. Here, it's very beautiful, but they do seem to have struggled a little bit, and it never really grew hugely. It's a medium-sized abbey, I'd say. If you compare it to Glastonbury, Tintern, some of the other abbeys that we've visited, it's more on scale like Sibton, which, if you look back to that video, I described as some stones in a field. This is fairly similar, but it's more substantial, and you can still see the fabric of the outline of the majority of buildings, and even make out some doors. But today it's an English heritage site, and it's pleasantly maintained. It certainly was pleasant today. It was a very sunny summer's day. I know you'll be watching this on a rainy day in the autumn, but it was a beautiful spot on a sunny day. Umbrellas were needed for the sun, not the rain, when I filmed this. But the abbey was suppressed in 1536, along with the rest of the abbeys in the dissolution of the monasteries. And it seems to have been left fairly as it was. There's not enough properties nearby to take the stones for. So right through until 1720, when they were thinking about building Waverley Abbey, it seems to have declined gently. But some of the stones were definitely taken from here and used in the house opposite. So it sits in Waverley, and King Stephen granted the abbey land here, and they were given all the land within the parish of Waverley, 2 acres of meadow down in Elstead, and the monks had permission to cut wood from Farnham woodland. Well, the Farnham woodland's long gone now. They also then got a grant of land at Wandsworth and allowed to dig turf heath, stones and sand. So they had a number of sources of income, but none of them were as wealthy as sources of income like sheep and wool, which really allowed some of the abbeys to become very powerful. Here's the only remaining roof. You can see an impression of how beautiful the abbey must have been. The church itself, the abbey church, is back there to the left. We'll go and have a look in a minute, but there's very little left of that. Here you can see not an insubstantial room. I believe this would have been one of the kitchens. Quite a beautiful structure. If you plaster that and you add back the floors that are missing, even today it looks lovely with the sun shining through the hole in the roof where the fan vaulting has completely collapsed. But quite a substantial structure, just hinted at today by the ruins. If you saw our video where we visited Castle Acre Priory, a much more substantial and grandiose structure that's remained, whereas here it would have been a more austere and simple structure, and it has felt the ravages of time. And this is actually the undercroft of the lay brothers refectory, because brothers were broken up into 2 classes, proper monks if you like, and lay brothers. And it would have had slightly separated work roles, time spent in the church, and also which part of the church you can go in, which sadly can't really see that today because it really is long gone. But if that was the refectory, we're going to head over now towards that large tree and along this wall, which is where the dormitories were. Dormitories are actually unusual here, that normally in an abbey the dormitories weren't on the ground floor but were on the first floor. You see that if you go to Battle Abbey or if you go to Castle Acre, which we visited before, you'll see how it's always upstairs to the dormitory. But here it was decided to build it on the ground floor. And you could see the overall structure of the wall, although much has been taken away. You still have a good feel for how it would have been, obviously removing these trees. And there's one tree in particular that's quite spectacular, which we're going to go to shortly. But this is the dormitory with the beautiful windows at the end there. This was the monks, no, not the lay brothers, but the monks. and it would have been fairly simple with rows of beds along the wall. Apart from the abbot, abbeys were not places to enjoy immense wealth for the clergy. They were places where the clergy prayed and worked, and yes, they had a roof over their head and food in their stomach, but it wasn't a cushy job. Now, for the abbots, that often was a little bit different, but the lay brothers also would have had the benefits of the abbey. The abbey gave them labour, employment, food, housing, lodging, a structure to their life, in return for which they had to do some manual labour, generally farming, and tend to the grounds and attend some church services, but not as many as the monks, who did lead a pretty Spartan and simple life. And here you would have had plaster, like you can see that concreted plaster on the wall, but it wasn't a plush dormitory. We're going to head over towards that huge tree. And that tree is a yew tree, which you often find in English churchyards. But here it's believed to date back pretty much to the Dissolution. So within a couple of years of the Dissolution of Monasteries in 1536, the tree was planted, or planted itself, and has grown over the remains of one end of the wall. Really is a beautiful yew tree. I think if you ever get a chance to go to Doveridge in Derbyshire near Uttoxeter, there's a beautiful yew tree in the entrance to the churchyard, which is bigger and grander and looks a lot older. But this is one of the best yew trees I've seen here. And you can see really not much left of the fabric, just enough for it to look like a pleasant ruin in a field for the owner of the abbey house to admire and walk with their guests on a summer's day. A bit like something out of Jane Austen. But the purpose and the completeness of the buildings wasn't really preserved. They have been left to fall into disuse and merely to serve as a feature, much like a lord might have built a ruin, a mock ruin in his grounds. These were ready-made. There doesn't seem to have been any respect for them or interest in them. I do find it fascinating how, after centuries of the abbeys being an essential part of English life, offering employment, being effectively landlords of a large part of the population, and providing much charitable support, they actually owned 1/4 of the land. I think it was 24% of the land in Britain was owned by church, and the majority of that was abbeys and priories and monasteries. So they provided that employment, and they provided that staple of everyday life for the countryside, as well as being a voice for the king, so long as the king didn't annoy the Pope. And suddenly Henry VIII says, put an end to this, everything's wiped away. And I understand the eagerness of people who gained property from that dissolution to take part, but they just ceased to matter. They ceased to be respected. This beautiful old ruin just left. And here's the yew tree. You can see still very strong, and believed to be from the 1540s apparently. So quite a substantial tree. They always look a bit old, and the gnarly bark that they have. And this would have been up near the altar would have been roughly where I'm standing or a few feet behind me, and the church would have run back down. Now it's just the two transepts on the side. Altar would have been roughly where I was. Behind that would have been 4 or 5 chapels, and then at the transept there would have been a rood screen, and the monks would have been the only people who worshipped at this end of the church. The lay brothers would have worshipped down at the transept and after, and you can see there the side of the transept. Very little remaining of it. Even the overall outline of the church has been lost, which for centuries so many people benefited from these abbeys. They weren't an entirely positive thing, but they were a cornerstone of English life, and suddenly it was gone, stolen away. All of their wealth disappeared. Their buildings turned into garden decorations and trinkets for people who sided on the right side with Henry VIII. And there seems to be very little said about it, because the poor did benefit from these. And with the disappearance of these abbeys, nothing really replaced that in the social fabric, that support for the working man. Because you have to remember, for centuries after, Parliament was controlled entirely by people whose interests were in benefiting from the poor. You may say that's the case now, but here down by the river, you can see it's a very slow river. Maybe it's silted up over the years, but it's not a very good choice of river for an abbey, I have to say. There's a really slow pace to the water. Maybe it was faster years ago, and there does seem to be evidence of it being dammed down by that building in the distance there. But really, here's Waverley Abbey House, which became the owner of this land. And I couldn't find who benefited from the dissolution of this particular abbey, because it seems to have been deserted for centuries before Sir John Ailesbury turned up. He was the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he had his house designed by Colin Campbell. And him and his brother settled down here, built the house, and then they kind of died off quite quickly in the 1720s. And it was sold off to Charles Child of Guildford, who then sold it to Orby Hunter. So it transferred through a series of ownerships till 1786. There were some wings added by Sir Robert Rich, the 5th Baronet. Rich is a suitable name, it seems. Today it's run by a charitable trust, and there's a small cafe, some beautiful grounds, and you can sit and soak up the sun, enjoy the view. Quite a few little remains of Second World War fortifications, because this was actually, part of it was, this was a military hospital for 5,000 soldiers during the war, and part of the abbey site was set out as the GHQ line. It was part of that, which was built to protect the capital during the Second World War if it was ever attacked. You can see a pillbox in the field. Most were a little harder to see, but really a beautiful little abbey. And I hope you enjoyed our visit, and please do like and subscribe, and join us for some other Unbound Histories on Saturdays and museum tours on Monday.